Welcome back to more Warhammer lore. In this video we will be delving into Malekith, the Witch King of Nagaroth, and leader of the Dark Elf faction. Now, we will be covering a lot of the same ground from Morathi, but this will be from the perspective of Malekith, and so pieces of the story will be missing if you watch the Morathi video. Likewise, there are pieces of the Morathi video that are missing that will only be in the Malekith side of story. And if you combine these, you get the whole Dark Elf history and how they came to be. And with that being said, I'll have links in the description to both my Morathi video and a few other videos, Elven videos that relate to Malekith in particular. Make sure to check those out. And with that, we will get into Malekith's backstory. Malekith, later to be known as the Witch King, is one of the sons of Anarion the Defender, the savior of Ulthuan and the Elven race, and Morathi, the Hag Queen and the supposed creator of dark magics. At this point in time, I have covered the Great Vortex and Anarion twice, so if you want more lore on that, see either my Dark Elf Society video or my recent Morathi lore video, which will also be linked into the description as I previously said. Needless to say, Malekith was raised as Anarion's heir to Nagarathi, a kingdom of Ulthuan, after he had lost both his previous wife and his two children. He was a shadow of his former self, and because of his loss, drew the Sword of Cain, which is said to have cursed his line in some way. Anarion's court after he wed Morathi is said to have become ever more increasingly bloodthirsty and militant than that of the other kingdoms. It was here that Malekith was raised by both his parents to be a warrior, general, prince, and ultimately a Phoenix King. As from even a very young age, his parents would constantly tell him that he was special and destined to rule over all other elves. The effect this would have had on Malekith psychologically may have in truth affected what he later would become, but it may have more to do with the ruinous powers and the curse of Cain than simply Malekith's personality. Malekith was raised as a warrior by his father and became highly skilled in all manners of war, from sword, spear, and bow to leading elves into battle and conducting a military campaign. At the same time, he was taught by his mother the Valley of Subterfuge and politics, as well as how to wield the winds of magic. The prince rose through the ranks of his father's army and earned the respect of his people through deed as well as birthright. After his father's death, Malekith knew that he would be chosen for the next Phoenix King. There was no doubt in his mind that things would turn out differently. So it was a great shock to him that the princes of the other kingdoms wanted to elect another as the next Phoenix King. Morathi, outraged by this turn of events, almost slew the council for their impudence, but it appears that Malekith, taking a page from his mother's book, could see the direction the decision was going and made a grand speech before the princes. He pleaded with the princes that he acknowledged that he was not his father and wished to honor his memory through his rule, but he would be fair and just. He then placed it at their feet that should they decide to choose another, he would not object. Many of the princes, after hearing this speech, nearly changed their vote, but when the Treeman Durthu showed up with his thought-dead half-sister, the new Everqueen, it was decided that Belshazzar should be the next Phoenix King. Of course, Malekith was disappointed, but true to his word, he was the first among the princes to pledge fealty to Belshazzar. I believe that even though he was in fact disappointed at the turn of events, he actually was sincere originally in his promise, but it also hurt his pride to think of another sitting on the throne. Though he does make the point that Belshazzar is not immortal, and the time will come when the princes will need to appoint another, and so he would make himself the inexcusable choice during the next election. Malekith was a warrior and general, and after his father had essentially sealed away the majority of the Chaos Incursion, by helping in the binding of the Great Vortex, there was no one left to fight on Ulthuan. And so the Prince of Nagarathi decided to go seek adventure away from Ulthuan, in the lands that would later be known as the Old World. It did not take him long to find what he was looking for. His first stop in the Old World was Athol Torlalian, one of the new colonies founded by the various princes of Ulthuan. When he arrived, the harbor was empty, and the settlement was being sieged by a vast horde of greenskins. It turns out that their prince simply sailed away with his men to supposedly get reinforcements, but it had been nearly a week and the prince had yet to return. Seeing an opportunity, Malekith told the people of Athol Torlalian, which was mostly composed of women, children, and elderly, and a very small garrison, which currently is all that is keeping the greenskins at bay, that if they wished for his help, they would need to swear fealty to him, and he would deliver them from these savages. If they did not, then he would simply sail away. Of course they agreed, and even though they were vastly outnumbered, Malekith's men were the hardened warriors of Nagarathi, easily a match for the hulking barbarians that outnumbered them nearly 100 to 1. True to his word, his men performed the task of routing the greenskins from the wall of the city and butchered a great portion of the horde, taking minimal losses. In fact, Malekith, utilizing spellcraft to fly from the battlements, engaged the leader of the Wa, easily dispatching the hulking black orc warboss by crippling him and ultimately taking his head. After establishing this colony as his own and swelling his ranks from the coming Nagarathi warriors from Ulthuan, Malekith decided to press further into the uncharted territory and began ridding the surrounding land of beastmen, greenskin, and many other abominations and remnants of the ruinous powers. It was after 3 years that his scouts stumbled upon a clearing of the forest, near the feet of a great mountain. This clearing appeared to have been thinned by skilled woodsmen, not to the defilement of beastmen or orc. It was then that Malekith met the dwarfs, and was amongst the first elves to be invited into their great holds. At first Malekith held the dwarfs in little standing, but after seeing the architecture and sheer size of their cracks, and the depth of the underway, he soon changed his mind on the squat men of the mountain. Malekith was invited into Krazakarak to see the High King of the Dwarfs, and he accepted this offer, as he planned on utilizing this newfound race as a political chip to make himself both richer and more powerful back in Ulthuan. He was allowed to take a retinue of 50 warriors and his 2 retainers, and through the dwarves' underway, they made the long trip to the center of the dwarven kingdoms. High King Snorri Whitebeard was a great leader of the dwarfs, and took a liking to Malekith, as he seemed more of a warrior than politician, much as the dwarven kings and thanes that he was used to dealing with. They went on a troll hunt together, and though Malekith had never seen a troll before, he found the hunt thrilling, and indeed ended up slaying the beast with his sword, and saving the High King from being eaten alive. At this event, the two became true friends. It was soon after that a great horde of beastmen was found to be sacking and pillaging dwarven outposts and land. A great throng of dwarves was pulled together, and Malekith, wishing to see what his new allies were like in battle, took his company of spearmen and accompanied the army. The dwarfs fought with little tact, but brute strength, and he witnessed their stubbornness to give ground, and indeed admired them for it. But he would not be outdone, and positioned his troops to thwart an ambush of goblin wolf riders that had joined the beastman horde, that surely would have taken a heavy toll on the dwarven back line. It was then that the leader of the horde made an appearance. No simple beastman, but a great dragon ogre Shaggoth was leading the horde, and Malekith, with the help of the High King, slew the great beast, both owing their lives to the other a few times over during the fight. After this victory, a great feast was held, and Snorri decided that the elves and dwarves would begin talks of a formal alliance and friendship. To this end, Malekith was made the ambassador of Belshazzar to the dwarves. This infuriated Malekith, as he saw it as an affront to his deeds that after securing this alliance, Belshazzar would get the credit and the spoils of this trade, and Malekith would be little more than a footnote in the eyes of the elves of Ulthuan. Begrudgingly, Malekith accepted and remained in contact with the dwarves, making many trips between his colonies and Krazakarak. His warriors even began to adopt the dwarven crossbows as weapons, although they made their own alterations, and a peace lasted many years between the races, and Malekith almost seemed content. It was also during this time that many believe Malekith fell in love with an elf maiden known as Alisara, and he took her as his wife. It is said that the two were deeply in love, but one day, Alisara, who was often gifted with visions from Lilith, her patron deity, could no longer see her husband's future. It became clouded and muddled. This troubled her, and she left without word of when or where she was going. Malekith searched for his wife day and night, but to no avail, and this was when he received message from Krazakarak that the High King was dying, and wished to see him. Malekith made haste to see his longtime friend one last time, and made it barely before his passing. In his last moments, Snorri Whitebeard made Malekith swear an oath that the dwarfs and elves would always be friends, and to this the Nagarathi swore this would come to pass, much to the pleasure of the High King. It was then that he passed, and something seemed to finally break in Malekith. Between the disappearance of his wife and the death of possibly his best and only friend, he decided to travel deeper and further into the lands of the north. He did not know what would await him on this adventure, and knew that the journey would be treacherous, and in fact there was a good chance he would not return at all. For this reason, he took 500 warriors with him, but he only took volunteers, and they had to be single and without any children to embark on this expedition. Despite the dangers, and a visit from his mother, after the few months it took to organize his campaign into the north, he set sail for what would later be known as the Chaos Wastes. The route took them back to Ulthuan, but they never made landfall. Instead, they skirted the isles that protected the shores of Nagarathi. Only the Blighted Isle caught the eye of Malekith, and some desire came over him. His father's body was never found, and in fact, no one had traveled to the Cursed Isle of Cain since Anarion supposedly placed the sword into the altar of the great temple at its center. Suddenly, the urge to retrieve his father's body and that of his dragon overcame him, as he thought to use them as perhaps a sign to the other princes that Belshazzar was weak and he should be the rightful Phoenix King. Of course, his trip would be foregone. However, there was no bones to be found of the great dragon, or even pieces of Anarion's enchanted armor, but there was the Widowmaker. When Malekith came close to it, he saw himself riding on a palanquin made of bone with a river of blood spilling beneath him. Elf, man, and dwarf were butchered before him, and all would fear him, and his rule would be absolute if he only took up the scepter of Cain. Through his sheer will, Malekith resisted the urge to take up the sword, and returned to his ship, shaking at the sight of his possible future. He would not be a slave to anyone, even a god. Without his father's body, he decided not to return to Nagarathi, and headed north and west and scouted the coastline for months. No map could be made, as the frozen land changed with the shifting of the seasons. The same could be said of the savage human tribes that they encountered, mostly nomadic. But the further inland they traveled, the better equipped and skilled the humans became, many sporting thick black plate armor and weapons gifted to them by the ruinous powers. Dark sorcerers and disfigured chieftains assailed them along with all manners of beasts and shambling abominations. This was the first time in 1,000 years Malekith had pitted himself against the forces of chaos, and though many of their champions were skilled, none could stand before him, and something kept him and his company moving in search of some fabled myth or doom that never materialized. Malekith searched the wasteland for some sign he would only recognize for many years in vain, until finally he decided to venture past the very gates of chaos into the unknown realm beyond. This did not come to pass, as a great blizzard swept through his camp, and in the morning they could see great structures off in the distance. It was an abandoned city, which appeared to have been built possibly centuries ago, although it is impossible to tell how much time has passed this close to the gates of chaos. But the buildings were large and vast, comparing in size to the Karats of the dwarfs, an architecture of unknown origin. Malekith sensed a magical pull emanating from the central building, and upon entering found a hidden passage masked by magic that led to another wing of the building. Here skeletons of a long-dead race lined the halls, and a great staircase led to a platform where another skeleton could be seen wearing a great curving crown made from a dark, unmown metal. This was the sign he had been waiting for. He placed the circlet upon his head, and the world vanished. Malekith found himself in a swirling maelstrom of colors that coalesced into a sky of black clouds and fire where the realms of chaos reside. In one direction he spied an unending garden, forlorn and decaying, filled with drooping willows and sullen grasses. Flies buzzed in thick clouds, and rivers of pus oozed between piles of rotting corpses. At the center, a great mansion stood with peeling paint and crumbling stone, hundreds of chimneys belching horrendous fumes into the air. Sickening bloated demons could be seen tending the garden, some cyclopean beasts with a single horn forever chanting. In another direction, Malekith spied a mighty citadel made up of glimmering mirrors and crystals every color of the rainbow. Magic swirled about the doors that yawned open, and windows which appeared to stare with lidless eyes. Fires burned from thin towers, and all about the place was a bizarre maze. From one of the towers, a huge demon with multicolored wings and a bird-like face wearing pink and purple robes looked up into the sky and stared at Malekith. He quickly diverted his gaze and saw a land sprawling with volcanoes and lava. Vast fortresses were built into the mountains, and skeletons of impossible creatures were piled high in crimson lakes of boiling blood. A tower of skulls made of black basalt, so large it filled his vision from his vantage point, towered high into the heavens. As his eyes traveled towards its top, he felt a being of unimaginable fury and hate lived there, and had no wish to meet its gaze. He then turned and was bewitched by a realm of enchanting beauty. Green glades and golden beaches bordered by majestic mountains called to him. Lithe forms of half-maidens languished throughout the paradise, laughing and chattering while caressing one another with their claws. And before he could be drawn any closer, Malekith snapped himself from his stupor, beginning to feel the eyes of the gods hovering over him. He wished to go anywhere but here, and suddenly he had visions of the entire Warhammer world. From the lizardmen of Lustria to the dwarven Carax, to great hordes of greenskins in the Badlands. All was laid out before him, and he finally understood what his mother and so many sorceresses had come to know. That all magic, good or ill, came from the energies of chaos, and all could be broken by his will. He was tugged back into the waking world, and found that with the iron circlet upon his head, he could clearly see the winds of magic, and easily manipulate it like he had never been capable before. It was finally time for him to return to Ulthuan. While Malekith explored the wider world, new trials beset Ulthuan in his absence. With the threat of demons gone, many of the lessons of hard war were forgotten. Many elves became indolent and selfish, indulging their heightened senses with ceremonies dedicated to exotic, forbidden gods. From the ancient temples of Nagarathi, they had risen, cults of luxury, pleasure and excess that grew within the cities and spread across the kingdoms. These cults practiced obscene rituals of debasement and sacrifice, and more followers were drawn to dark shrines dedicated to gods that should not be worshipped. Many of these elves sought to escape the bitter grief that the Chaos Incursion had left within their lives. In temples filled with beating drums, haunting pipes, and narcotic vapors, they danced and feasted and sang blasphemous praises. Belshazzar seemed powerless to quell the growing unrest in his realm. The pleasure cults were gaining more sway with every passing season. The unknown but foul heart of the cults was Nagarathi, but Belshazzar was hesitant to act against the lands of Anarian's people. Princes caught in the grip of the cults began to mutter that Belshazzar was weak and an usurper of the Phoenix Throne. Malekith's return to Ulthuan was a timely one. For Belshazzar, this heralded an opportunity, for he now had a tool to strike out at the pleasure cults that not only was effective, but also would minimize any risk to his rule. Malekith vowed to hunt down the cults and exterminate them, claiming that no kingdom would be beyond his wrath, not even Nagarathi. When Malekith discovered that his mother was the chief architect of the cults, he renounced her and ordered that she be imprisoned upon her capture, along with thousands of her misguided disciples. Nobody was above Malekith's scrutiny, from the lowest farmer to the most vaunted prince. Those cultists who surrendered were sent to the castles of Nagarathi to be released from their delusions. Yet it seemed nothing short of outright war would quell the rise of the decadent cults. In his first incursion into the lands of his people, he was led into a trap after taking a keep from cultists and was forced to flee back to Tiranoc. He used this defeat to garner more support for a larger army, and personally led a large host of elves from many other nations to retake his capital of Englec. Utilizing the clan of Anar, Malekith had the gates of the impenetrable fortress at the heart of Nagarathi opened before his armies and easily took the city. The cults had been busy, and it was under Morathi's rule that the great statues of the various Sithrai gods could be seen throughout the capital with grisly offerings placed about their feet. Malekith made his way to his father's former keep, alone, to find his mother sitting upon his throne. It was then that she informed him of her plans for the cults, and she sensed the change that had overtook her son. He appeared to be much more gifted in the realms of magic, and an even fiercer warrior after returning from the wastes. It was then that through veiled threats and half-truths that his mother unveiled her plans for the cults and how they could aid him in his pursuit of the Phoenix Throne. Morathi was brought back to Tiranoc by her son, and she was given leniency by the king, because Malekith begged for her life to be spared, and instead she would be taken as a prisoner in the very castle of Belshazzar. Having thought the cults scattered, Belshazzar allowed Malekith to continue his pursuit of its remnants. However, instead of the cults fading, they seemed to grow and fester in more kingdoms than before. In truth, Malekith was using his position to instead get rid of any opposition to the next stage of his plan, while his mother, through private meetings with her son, managed the cults and undermined the Phoenix King's authority. Finally, when the time was right, Malekith asked for the Council of Princes to convene at the Shrine of Asurion, and made a stop at the palace of Bel-Shinar before leaving himself. Once he was alone with the Phoenix King, Malekith forced poison down the pompous elf's throat and planted a few Sithrai totems around his bedchamber. Upon his arrival at the shrine, he strode into the temple confidently and in full armor, escorted by his knights. Almost every prince from the various kingdoms was present. They began to ask when Bel-Shinar was to be expected. To this, Malekith claimed that the Phoenix King was found to be a cultist in secret, and had taken his own life cowardly through poison, rather than be brought here before them. Of course, the princes were shocked, and Malekith further explained to them that their judgment could not be trusted, as they elected a terrible leader before, and himself being the only person present who was beyond reproach, should now be the next Phoenix King. Cries of heresy and outrage filled the temple, but before Malekith could rebuttal, the high priest of the shrine cried out and pointed at Malekith's waist. No one, even the Phoenix King himself, was allowed to carry a weapon in the holiest of places, and every prince in the hall was disarmed and only wearing essentially robes. With a sneer, Malekith drew his blade, and his soldiers did the same and began butchering the defenseless elves. Malekith, having heard that Bel-Shinar had required spells of protection cast on him before he entered the flame, made his way to the pillar of fire, and during the bloody melee entered it as his father had. At first there was nothing, no heat, only a bright light. Then there was pain, dull at first, but soon agonizing, and Malekith felt his armor melt from his body, and his skin began to slough off, revealing the muscle beneath. The worst was the heat that seemed to eat away at his very soul. It was worse than his vision of the realms of chaos, and only his will to live allowed him to throw himself from the flames. When Malekith awoke, he was in the arms of his mother, her tears spilling on his cheek. Everything hurt, but he managed to whisper, and after that his mother took him back to Nagarathi. To the elves of Ulthuan, and even that of his people, he had died in the flames. His mother was spinning the lies that through treachery, the other princes had somehow tainted the flames in an effort to stop her son from taking his rightful place. It was then, after many years of dark magic being poured into his mangled body, that he was able to recover enough strength to undergo a blasphemous rite to return to him his vigor and might. Through Morathi's seduction of the head priest of Val, a new set of armor, black as midnight, was forged. In it, runes of power and dark magic was poured, and the pieces were placed upon the prince's withered form, still smoldering from the forge. At first the pain was excruciating, but nothing compared to the flames of Asuryan. After the last piece was placed, and the ritual complete, Malekith felt all his strength return, and then some. It was when he finally adorned his iron circlet that the prince known as Malekith was no more, and the Witch King was born. He had the crown mended to his helm so that it would never leave him again. His armor never completely cooled, and in fact, when the Witch King speaks, you can see streams rising from within him, and an unearthly glow around his eyes. Malekith was gifted a dark dragon from his mother, and upon his rebirth, all of Ulthuan would tremble. At the head of vast armies of cultists and Nagarathi warriors, the now Druchi as they were known, surged forth into the lands of the High Elves, leaving destruction and chaos in their wake. Unfortunately for Malekith, the remaining princes had elected the grandson of Kallador Dragon Tamer, Imrik, now known as Kallador I, as their Phoenix King. Unlike Bel-Shinar, Kallador was a warrior and excellent general, and despite the Dark Elf advantages, total victory could never be assured, until finally, after hundreds of years, they were forced to meet in combat. For what it was worth, Kallador fought bravely and managed to rally the losing battle. However, he was struck down from the sky atop his dragon, and Malekith pursued. Kallador's head would be his, but before his black dragon could tear the Phoenix King in two, Kallador thrust the lance of another High Elf prince into the beast, killing it instantly. Malekith was thrown from his dead steed, but didn't lose sight of his target. The White Lions attempted to intercept the Witch King, but were quickly cut down. Kallador was completely defenseless, having been severely wounded and exhausted from the long fight, and lucky for him, he had coerced the Phoenix Guard for the first time into an open battle. There, the guardians of the Temple of Asuryan appeared to defend the king before Malekith could finish him. He slew many, but their halberds, blessed by their deity, began to reawaken the old flames of Asuryan across his body, and he was forced to flee back to Nagarathi. The Dark Elf army routed despite having the upper hand, and both armies were decimated. Morathi, sensing an opportunity, made a bold suggestion to the Witch King. They would unbind the vortex and take control of a vast demon horde to slay their enemies, and then they would rebind it once they were finished. Of course, there was always the chance it could not be remade, but Malekith could not stand to see another king on the throne, and thought it better that the world burn if he could not have his prize. This plan ultimately led to failure, as the ancient mage Kalidor Dragontamer awoke from his stasis at the center of the unraveling vortex and reforged the spell. The magical backlash was great, and a huge tidal wave crashed over Ulthuan. Fortunately, many of the Dark Elf fortresses were prepared for this, and were kept afloat across the ocean. Having suffered complete defeat, Malekith decided to take his people in these black arcs to his former questing grounds to the north, in the land of Chill, near the Chaos Wastes. Once Malekith's personal arc was beached, it was his scouts who quickly found rich lodes of minerals in the mountains. But Malekith's people had no aptitude for mining and smelting, nor for building the walls that would be needed to keep away the mutant beasts, nor for farming or animal husbandry. They were warriors, and most had known nothing but war against demons, orcs, beastmen, and lastly against their fellow elves. Malekith soon realized that although he still had a formidable fighting force, his people cared nothing for the building of a new civilization. If the Druchii were to build a new kingdom in the west, they would need a workforce to build it for them. So began the bloodthirsty raids of the Dark Elves. At first their attacks were directed solely against their kin in Ulthuan, to take food and other supplies. The High Elves for the most part would fight to the death rather than be taken in battle, and so Malekith's labor force did not grow quickly. Then were to ride from ships that had traveled further east to the forests and mountains of the colonies, where Malekith had once fought alongside the dwarfs. Primitive humans lived there, in caves and mud huts. They were brutal and stupid, but the Dark Elves did not care, for humans also bred quickly and were physically strong. Shortly after, a campaign to retake Ulthuan was drawn, and the Dark Elves successfully invaded the northern parts of the Isle, but Kalidor kept them in check long enough to build the first of many gates from the outer kingdoms to the inner. It was known as the Griffin Gate. Malekith's forces could go no further on land, and so the sea would be the next battlefield. The sea battle raged for over 200 years, but the High Elves gained the upper hand and ultimately repelled the Dark Elves again from Ulthuan. But, as a caveat, Malekith, through his mother, was able to single out Kalidor, and before the Phoenix King could be captured, he threw himself overboard of his ship and drowned in the sea. During the war, the Dark Elves had been defeated several times. Many of their commanders feared returning to Naggarond, wary of the Witch King's temper and the machinations of Morathi. They instead made landfall on the coast of the Sea of Malice, many miles south of Naggarond, and here they built a city for themselves. The city was named Hagraith, the Dark Crag. Situated in a sheer-sided valley, the location of their new city was easily defensible against the creatures of the mountains and any punitive attack that Malekith might launch. An icy river that flows through the city of the Sea of Malice provided a natural harbor for the Dark Elf fleets. Over the coming years, Hagraith attracted other Dark Elves seeking to elude the Witch King for some real or perceived misdeed. Many of the raiders who traveled back from across the ocean first put into Hagraith to unload a portion of their slaves and spoils before Malekith took his share. Sensing that this cauldron of dissent might prove rebellious in the future, Malekith at first thought to crush the dissidents and punish them for their insubordination. His hand was stayed by the intervention of Morathi, who had a greater aptitude for subtle politics than her son. Guided by Morathi's counsel, Malekith accepted this new city. He promised rule of the south coast of the Sea of Malice to the rulers of Hagraith. An oath of fealty to the Witch King would ensure their protection. It was a masterful stroke, for the Dark Elf nobles of Hagraith were soon gathering their power and took to fighting amongst themselves. Driven by their selfish ambitions, the rulers of Hagraith looked to Malekith for favor, for they knew that the Witch King's support could tip the ongoing power struggle engulfing their city. Malekith invited half a dozen of the most powerful nobles of Hagraith to a feast. He offered them a choice. One of the goblets of wine on the table, he told them, was poisoned. Any one of them willing to risk his life to rule should take a drink, and Malekith would grant that noble a share of the city. 3 of the nobles snatched up goblets without hesitation and downed their contents. They knew that it was better to be poisoned than suffer under the rule of the others. The last three one by one also drank, forced to prove their worth by the boldness of their peers. It was now that Malekith announced that in fact all of the wine was poisoned, and only by swearing unfailing loyalty to the Witch King would the princes receive the antidote. The other princes who vied for control bargained with Malekith for warriors and sorcerers, and traded slaves and ships in return for his patronage. Caught up with their petty schemes, each of the ruling families eventually fell under the sway of Malekith, and only through the Witch King's patronage could they resist the ambitions of their opponents. In the end, they ruled only in name, for the Witch King had played them off against each other and now controlled them utterly. Remnants of the many pleasure cults from Ulthuan continued to hold sway over the Dark Elves, but one sect in particular rose to dominate all others. They were the cultists of Cain, the god of murder, and their bloody sacrifices made a great spectacle for the Dark Elves. The fumes from their pyres swathed the city of the Witch King, and bloodthirsty mobs ran rampant through the streets, killing and maiming in mindless bursts of violence. Rather than quell these excesses, Malekith sought to focus the devotion of these elves and turn it to his own ends. The Witch King proclaimed himself a mortal incarnation of Cain, his merciless instrument in the realm of the living. Malekith swore undying devotion to the Lord of Murder in the shrine of Naggarond, and poured a goblet of his divine blood into the braziers where the witch elves burnt the hearts of their sacrifices. For the first time, the armies of the dark gods poised themselves at the borders of Naggaroth and fell upon Grond, Morathi's dark tower. The fighting was fierce, and Malekith's black guard finally arrived with the Witch King himself to send the servants of the ruinous powers back into the waste. It was decided that many defenses of their new homeland would need to be made, and construction on watchtowers began in earnest across the north and south of Naggaroth. Shortly after this, word was received of a formal alliance of elf and dwarf being made, and fearing the combined strength of such an alliance, Malekith, with Morathi's help, devised a plan to separate the forces of order. Though through Malekith's knowledge of the Dark Elves and the assassinations of dwarven caravans, the seeds of hate were sown. However, it wasn't until a Rune Lord was killed by a Dark Elf sorcerer that the confrontation came to a head and the nations went to war. After hundreds of years, the current Phoenix King, Kalidor II, was killed in single combat by Gotrek Starbreaker, the Dwarven High King, and Malekith took this as a sign to launch another attack on Ulthuan. Unfortunately, the High Elf princes under attack by the Druchii appointed a new Phoenix King immediately. Caradriel of Yvres was crowned, and he called back all the High Elves from the Elven colonies to help defend their homeland from the overwhelming numbers of the Dark Elves. He was a cunning tactician, and came up with a system of rotating troops at the many gates that separated the inner and outer kingdoms, so that the Dark Elves eventually ran out of stamina, as they were constantly facing fresh troops. The war drew to a stalemate, and Caradriel, after 600 years, died peacefully in his bed, and a new king, Tethlis, was crowned. It was Tethlis' campaign that would see the Dark Elves banished from their lands. But this Phoenix King, like the ones before him, met his end. This time, however, no one knows how it happened. All that is known is that Tethlis went to the Blighted Isle, and went into the Shrine of Cain. His body was found shortly after. Either one of the many Cainite assassins finally killed him, or perhaps he attempted to wield the Widowmaker to annihilate his foes, and his own guard killed him. No one really knows. Exhausted by centuries of war, both the High Elves and Dark Elves had spent the last of their strength during the scouring. In Naggaroth, the survivors of the war drifted back to their homes, quiet and chastened by defeat. Even the all-night sacrifices ordered by Hellebron, and the hunts organized by the Witch King could do little to lift the morale of the Dark Elves. The fleet commanders willing to dare the High Elf patrols to the east were few, and raiding ships slipped away and returned as soul hunters, unable to gather in great strength and repeat the mighty invasions of the past. It was then that an underground river was discovered that would bypass the forces of Ulthuan, allowing the Dark Elves to begin their raids in earnest. Direct war against the High Elves would serve no purpose. Malekith realized outright aggression would only stir them from their introverted decline, while the Witch King could use more subtle means to defeat his foes from within. Advised by Morathi, Malekith poured support into the many cults and sects that the Dark Elves participated in, openly supporting high priests and high priestesses like Hellebron, Aegithir, and Karathi. The cult ceremonies became ever more extravagant and widely attended. Luxuries were heaped upon the most dedicated followers of the Dark Elves' sinister gods. From amongst the ranks of these fervent worshippers, the Witch King selected the most intelligent and devoted, and they were sent to learn the arts of subterfuge and spying from the assassins of Cain. When they were ready, these agents traveled one at a time by hidden routes to the shores of Ulthuan. They blended in with the High Elves and assumed normal lives as carpenters and smiths, as fanners and poets. All the while, they began to stray their poisonous beliefs, and the ancient cults of pleasure began to grow again. This time the cults were insidious and subtle, daring none of the flamboyant rituals that had exposed them in the time of Belshazzar. Century by century, generation by generation, the hidden sects flourished, a dark canker at the heart of Ulthuan, that remained unseen by those who reigned. When Athos succeeded Bel-Kahadras as Phoenix King, Malekith knew that the time had arrived to unleash his hidden agents. Athos was a weak-willed ascetic. Under his reign the Arch rose in prominence, and under the cover of this, the cults created by Malekith expanded swiftly and struck without warning. Kidnappings and murders blighted the cities of Ulthuan. Terror of the unseen foe gripped the land, paralyzing the High Elves. Nobles were found slain in their beds, mages disappeared from their towers, and children vanished from their classrooms. Panic swept through Ulthuan, as these crimes grew in boldness and horror, until Athos finally acted. Although Malekith's cultists were wreaking havoc, they were not unopposed. When Bel-Kahadras had built the White Tower of Hoeth, he founded a company of mystical guardians to protect it, the Swordmasters. Unknown to either the Phoenix King or Malekith, the Swordmasters were waging a silent war against the pleasure cults, and the conflict came to a climax in Lothran itself, when fighting erupted on the streets of the city between Nagarathi agents and the warriors of the Swordmasters, during which the cultists were all slain, forced to abandon some of their bolder plans at the persecution of the Swordmasters. The cults of excess faded back into High Elf society and continued their secretive work. Even as cultists were uncovered and executed, more agents were dispatched from Nagaroth to swell the ranks of the cults. Some of these were discovered and slain as soon as they landed on the coast. Others slipped through the guard of the High Elves and established themselves as their predecessors had done. This century-long infiltration reached fruition when Githerion, one of Malekith's most trusted agents, acquired the position of Chancellor to the Phoenix King. Girathon used his power to subvert much of Athos' command and spread confusion throughout the realm. When his loyalties were uncovered, Girathon assassinated the Phoenix King before he was slain himself. Malekith ordered a parade and 3 days of bloodletting in gratitude of the slain agent. What made Girathon's death all the more remarkable was its utter falsehood. Girathon had long been the Witch King's spy master, and when he became directly involved with the Phoenix King, he engineered his own capture and the subsequent opportunity to strike down Athos. During the long wait between the new employ of the cults and the assassination of the Phoenix King, Malekith seemed to lose sight of his ultimate goal, and became rather set in his ways. It was at this time that word of his former wife, Alisara, was brought to him by messengers from Athaloran. In truth, Malekith had forgotten about her long ago, but news of her desire to see him fanned the fire of hope in his heart, and he eagerly awaited her arrival. Of course, this would never come to pass, as Morathi, sensing her son's current state, had the Wood Elf killed at the hands of the High Elf noble through her schemes and treachery. When news reached Malekith of his wife's death, he went into a fury and snapped out of his former rut, as the need for vengeance burned brightly once again, and another attack on Ulthuan was planned. It was then that a contingent of Wood Elves was found to have attacked the Tower of Grund, and after connecting the dots, Malekith realized that his mother was the one responsible for his wife's death. He had his mother imprisoned, but ultimately decided to spare her, because he begrudgingly acknowledged that if not for her, he possibly would have given up on his quest to become the ruler of all the elves, and gave her a pass this one last time. A new Phoenix King was elected known as Morvel, and after another Dark Elf incursion, it was he who instituted levies on all elves, that they be trained with either the bow or spear, and used this militia to combat the Dark Elves. The first few levies fared badly against the hardened warriors of Nagorond, but they were enough to hold the Griffin Gate. Morathi and Malekith began using their dark magics to deliver nightmares upon the Phoenix King, in hopes of breaking him, but he held true. Eventually the Dark Elves were once again driven from the lands of Ulthuan, but not before Morvel finally cracked and committed suicide by throwing himself into the fires of Assyrian. This would make the 7th Phoenix King Malekith had seen dead, and he vowed that he would outlive them all and ultimately claim his birthright. Malekith now turned his gaze from Ulthuan and set his sights on the wider world. For an age, the warriors of Nagaroth put aside their bloody wars with their kin on Ulthuan to venture further and further abroad across the oceans. Driven by the urge to gather an ever greater power, Dark Elf ship captains and glory-hungry princes set out across the oceans seeking plunder and adventure. Competition between the many family dynasties that held sway in the cities created inter-house rivalries that fueled the massive expansions of the raiding fleets. Any Dark Elf with the right blend of determination, bravery, and ruthlessness could make his or her fortune fighting on the distant shores. From the boiling sea, Black Arks could now raid the oriental lands of the farther east. Yet for the Dark Elves, these were uncharted territories, and for each fleet that returned with prizes and slaves, half a dozen came back to Nagaroth in failure. The Witch King himself once traveled to the farthest reaches of the world, and personally led many attacks. At one eastern capital, mystics called up strange illusions and beastly apparitions to assail the Dark Elves, as they stormed the towers protecting the city. Malekith unleashed his own sorceries, driving the mystics insane and boiling their blood in their veins. The city was little more than a ruin when Malekith left, and as a last contemptuous act, he summoned up a great wave to drown their remains. The broken domes of shrines and the walled steps of the Great Pyramid Temple still break the waves at low tide, an ominous reminder of the Witch King's power. As the wealth of barbaric lands flooded into the Witch King's treasury, the Dark Elf fleets expanded once again, ultimately eclipsing the all-but-forgotten glories of long ago. At Malekith's command, they recommenced their raids upon Ulthuan's shores, wreaking havoc wherever they could. Advantage was also sought in subtler ways. Dark Elf ships shadowed Ulthuan merchant vessels as they plied their trade, learning the location of the High Elves' closest allies. This information in turn allowed the Dark Elves to infiltrate the courts of such realms. Some they struck bargains with, others they set about undermining in order to deny aid to the High Elves in the war that was sure to come. Over the course of centuries, many realms experienced both the cold embrace and the wicked betrayal of Dark Elf diplomacy. Yet few who had been bloodied by Malekith's claws were entirely reluctant to welcome him as an ally afterward. Bitterness had done little to dull the Dark Elf's allure. When they wished it, the Witch King's ambassadors could speak charmingly enough to soothe even the rawest of grudges, and they were wealthy enough to awaken the most closely guarded avarice. It helped also that Malekith's emissaries were steeped in the most sinful and hidden of desires, and they used this knowledge to unlock that which would otherwise have been fixed against them. Only in Athel-Loren did their honeyed words fall upon deaf ears. Wood Elves listened politely for a time, then bade the Dark Elves leave and never return. Malekith watched with grim pleasure as the tendrils of Dark Elf influence spread across the globe. By this time, the Witch King had so many informers in Cat's Paws and others' lands that he often received word of a High Elf fleet arriving at his destination before the Phoenix King did. Better still, with but a careful stroke of his puppet strings, Malekith could assail his hated foes with the armies and fleets of others' lands, with his involvement secret to all but a few easily disposed of pawns. For more than 200 years, the Witch King reveled in this new method of war. Indeed, so much cruel delight did these manipulations elicit that Malekith could well have continued upon this path for many centuries more, had his spies not brought unwelcome tidings. Despite their woes, the High Elves had not lost heart. If anything, Finnebar the Seafarer, the newly crowned Phoenix King, succeeded in uniting his people to a degree unseen since the days of Anarion. This indeed was news that could not be borne. Summoning Morathi and his closest counselors to his side, the Witch King swept from his throne room and into a storm-racked night. It was time for the armies of Nagaroth to vent their full fury upon Ulthuan once more. However, once again a great chaos horde mustered on the borders of Nagaroth, and Malekith did not feel he could assault Ulthuan and leave his lands vulnerable to attack. The threat of these barbarians was turned into a great opportunity, and through Morathi, the barbarians were brought to heel. Utilizing her seductive talents, she coerced the chieftains of the Northmen into joining her, and this great chaos army joined Malekith on his attack on Ulthuan. The High Elves had a resurgence of new heroes to defend their homeland, primarily the twins Tyrion and Teclis. The brothers are descendants of Anarion, making Malekith their uncle. Tyrion received Anarion's blessings of martial prowess, and was the best the High Elves had to offer when it came to the sword and spear. Teclis was the opposite of his brother, in that he was physically weak but was gifted beyond measure in magical prowess. But even these great heroes could not single-handedly stop the Dark Elf invasion. The size and force of the combined Dark Elf and Chaos attack swept aside all resistance. Black arcs beached across Nagarathi, and the armies of darkness smashed through the Phoenix Gate and Unicorn Gate, while the Marauders were left to burn and plunder as they saw fit. The vanguard of the Dark Elves spread into the woodland realm of Avalorn, home of the Everqueen. Malekith's aim was twofold: to sow panic and dismay with the Everqueen's death, and to corrupt the powerful magic that she wielded. Though the Witch King's forces stormed through Avalorn and surrounded the camp of the Everqueen, she escaped with the aid of Prince Tyrion, her lover, who cut his way through the Dark Elves and fled with the Everqueen into the deep forests. The Dark Elves burnt Avalorn, raising woodland and meadow as they hunted for the Everqueen and her companion. Elsewhere, the armies of Nagaroth advanced without pause. Malekith's generals, eager to outdo their rivals, the Blighted Isle swiftly fell, and once again the Nagarathi held the altar of Cain. In Illyrian, the Horsemasters sought to fight back, but the sorcery of Malekith destroyed their army and scattered the survivors. Dark Elf ships broke through Lothran into the inner seas, and victory was within Malekith's grip. While Ulthuan burned, the Witch King demanded that the Everqueen be found, or that her body be brought to him as proof of her death. Several assassins of Cain pledged their lives and souls to bringing Alariel to Malekith, and then set out on their quest. In the blasted lands of Avalorn, they played a deadly game of cat and mouse with the Everqueen and her guardian. Despite coming close on several occasions, the Dark Elves always found their prey had eluded them, but the net grew ever tighter. Only at Lothran in the White Tower were the Dark Elf armies checked in their advance. Besieged and desperate defenders held out, praying to the gods for salvation. Malekith gloried in the destruction incarnate and mercilessly crushed every army raised against him. He would strangle all hope from his enemies, and then finish them forever. Yet a glimmer of hope remained for the High Elves, despite the darkness that had engulfed their lands. The Everqueen still lived, even if in hiding, and tales were heard of a young mage from Safri who wielded magical power that was the match for the Witch King's sorcery. He brought down storms of lightning upon his foes, and engulfed armies with conflagrations of white flame. He was Teclis, brother of Prince Tyrion, and soon Malekith and his followers would curse his name. The assassins seeking the Everqueen came upon their prey one night, almost by chance. Prince Tyrion fought with savage skill and defiance, and slew all 4 hunters. Yet with his dying breath, the last assassins sent forth a demonic familiar to bring word to the Witch King of the Everqueen's location. His followers having failed, Malekith decided to call upon the strength of the dark gods, and made a pact with a greater demon of Slaanesh named Nakari. In return for sacrifices and dark favors, Nakari would hunt down Alariel and devour her soul. With chilling shrieks of joy, Nakari set off on the hunt, speeding through the charred forests of Avalorn in search of the Everqueen. The greater demon descended upon Tyrion, and Alariel in the last twilight hours of the night. For all his power and skill, Tyrion was wounded and easily smashed aside by Nakari. As the 4-armed demon of chaos loomed over the Everqueen, lightning suddenly erupted from the darkness, hurling Nakari back. In the starlight stood an emaciated figure, a sword wreathed in crackling magic in his hand. It was Teclis, Mage Lord of Safri. With a bellow of hatred, Nakari attacked, but a great corrosion of energy engulfed Teclis. At its touch, the shimmering sphere broke, and the magical aura binding Nakari to the world of mortals, casting it back into the realms of chaos. Feeling that his creature had been banished, Malekith howled with frustration. Enraged that the Everqueen still lived, Malekith gathered his generals and began preparing for the inevitable end to his occupation of Ulthuan. He secretly began sending his troops back to Nagaroth, leaving the majority of the fighting and dying up to his Chaos allies. This finally came to a head in one climactic battle, where even with his diminished numbers, the Dark Elf army vastly outnumbered the High Elves' last bastion. Lord Tyrion led the High Elf defense, and he engaged Poison Blade, the champion of Malekith, in single combat. If not for the interference of Morathi, whom believed that Tyrion was an Arryn reborn, Poison Blade would have slew the Elven champion, but instead Tyrion cut down Poison Blade, and the morale of the Dark Elf army forced Malekith to enter the fray. Seeing that the strength of Ulthuan could not prevail against the might of Nagaroth, Teclis sought to destroy the Witch King. The Elven mage whispered a prayer to Asuryan and drew on the power of his staff, gifted to him by Alariel. With all of his prayers behind it, Teclis unleashed a bolt of energy directly at the Witch King. Realizing his peril, Malekith turned all his art and power to deflecting the deadly blast, but was too slow to divert it entirely. The bullet struck the Witch King and engulfed him with its energies. No ordinary spell, the magical blast awakened the vengeance of Asuryan that still lingered within Malekith's soul and had burnt within the breast of Malekith for nearly 5,000 years. The wound of old, the hideous burning that would never leave him, raged anew throughout Malekith's body, searing his flesh and mind. Tormented by the god's judgment, Malekith summoned the last of his power and hurled himself into the realms of chaos to escape the crushing agony. It was here in the realms of chaos that the flames were quelled, and Malekith spent many years in the realms of the ruinous powers. Here he was challenged by the demon Nakari, who demanded its payment for its services to the Witch King. Malekith then fought an epic battle that apparently lasted years with the greater demon. Ultimately, he wounded the demon, but not before one of the large horns of Nakari's head had pierced Malekith's armor, and both were forced to retreat. Sometime later, Malekith's wounded body was found in Nagaroth. He does not remember how he ended up back in the realm of the living, but his experiences in the realms of chaos changed him, hardening him, making him even more of a cold, ruthless king than before. Later, during one of the festival months held by the cults of pleasure in Nagaroth, a great portal opened up in the Witch King's capital, and hordes of Slaaneshi demons spilled from the realms of chaos into the streets, led by none other than Nakari. Having spent the last year recovering, the Witch King whom last time they fought was recently wounded and exhausted from a previous battle, was more than a match for the demon. He single-handedly lopped the head from the greater demon and banished the Chaos Horde back to the realms they spilled from. With this victory over our champion of the Dark Gods, Malekith felt renewed and decided to once again sow terror across the world. It is here that he is currently poised to begin yet another attack on the High Elves, or perhaps an expedition into Lustria. Either way, blood will flow, and the Witch King will not be denied again his conquests. That's it for Malekith's backstory. It was a long one, I know. And now we will get into his magical items. Malekith has several magical items and a unique mount at his disposal, which will likely make an appearance in Total War. The first being the Destroyer, his sword, which he forged himself utilizing dark magic, and is said that the merest touch can unmake enchantments or draw in knowledge from the minds of wizards. I would think this would act as a debuffing aura of some kind, either limiting the winds of magic for the enemy or perhaps a melee defense or attack debuff. The next is the Supreme Spell Shield, which can absorb energy and unleash it back at the foe. If this is included, I see this as a bound ability that perhaps can't be activated until you enter melee combat, and then the cooldown begins for a powerful magic missile. He also has the Armor of Midnight, which should grant him a large ward state overall, and is both adept at repelling spells and melee weapons, and his last item is the Circlet of Iron, his crown, basically, which greatly raises the winds of magic around him, which should definitely be in the game, I hope, because we did see it in the trailer. In addition to these items, Malekith has a unique black dragon he rides named Seraphon, a descendant of one of the original black dragons, Sulek, who he rode into battle against Kalador I. It has been confirmed that we are getting Malekith in Total War Warhammer 2, obviously. He will retain Seraphon as a mount, as well as a Cold One and a Cold One chariot. Malekith will be a powerful melee sorcerer hybrid lord, with access to, one would assume, dark magic, but he does know many other lores, particularly Shadow, so perhaps he will be a hybrid magic chain in his skill tree as well. And that has been Malekith the Witch King. He is definitely one of my favorite characters in the Warhammer world. He is kind of that lovable bastard at first, and then as you read his story, slowly over time, you like him, but then you're like, man, this guy is kind of a piece of crap. He just turns into this terrible tyrant, just capable of all kinds of like morbid torture and just desires for just bloodshed. And this could be the influence of the Dark Gods, or maybe Cain, or Marathi, or anything really. I'm not sure if his very soul has been corrupted, but also the flames of Asuryan may in fact have burned away what little good there was left of the man beforehand. But hopefully you have learned a little bit about Malekith and the Dark Elves in general, since this covered a great swath of their history. and I will be doing more lore videos. I appreciate all my new subscribers and all the views I'm getting and all the support I'm getting to make these videos. Your patronage is greatly sought after by myself, and I will be doing more lore videos on different races of the Warhammer world, so look forward to those. And I have been Jumbo Thick. I hope to see you guys in the next one. Have a good day.